Welcome back to Pump Take Sports. Today we're going to be talking about the state of the North Division in the NHL and how the fates of two teams have completely swapped from where they were at the beginning of the season. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Montreal Canadians and the Edmonton Oilers. Do you want to get us started on the Montreal Canadiens here, Alex?
Yeah, so the Habs and the Oilers have more or less completely swapped their places in the North Division. If you recall, Montreal got off to a super hot start. Edmonton didn't start hot, and one team's cooled off, and the others started to heat up as of late. And as we saw over the past couple days, the Habs fired their head coach Claude Julien and replaced him with their as of now interim head coach Dominique Ducharme. And since then, I mean, at the time we're recording this anyway, the Habs have played 2 games against Winnipeg, and they've lost both of them, one in regulation, one in overtime. So I think for the Habs, they obviously got off to a very hot start this season, but I think what their downfall is beyond the head coaching was that they simply don't have that game-changing player. Like every other team, it seems, has one of those. I mean, with the Oilers, you've got McDavid and Draisaitl. With the Leafs, you've got Matthews. With Calgary, you've got a guy like Johnny Gaudreau, someone who can step in and change the game just by flick of the wrist. The Habs don't really have that guy yet. I know they've got some potential to add to that front. I mean, Nick Suzuki is going to be a very talented player in the future. But as of now, I mean, their game changer, would be Carey Price, but he's kind of in a bit of a slump right now, so they haven't really been getting as much as I guess they'd hope from him. I do think the head coaching change had to happen for the Habs, and it has nothing to do with Claude Julien being a bad coach. I think it was, I got a buddy who's a Habs fan, and the way he described it to me was just sort of, it's sort of like a Babcock situation light there. Like he's not demanding that Nick Suzuki, make a list of the hardest working players, and there's no like mental abuse or anything like Babcock was doing. It's not that serious, but he's kind of got Claude Julien, to my understanding, kind of had some of his own tendencies that he wouldn't break up. Stuff like he'd play Philip Deneau in crucial situations, even though he hasn't scored a goal in almost a calendar year, if I recall correctly. And he kind of had his guys that he would play more often than not. And I think it's just a typical situation of a coach that kind of overstayed his welcome. I think Mark Bergevin said it best when he was addressing it in his press conference. He said the players needed a new voice. And I think while the Habs obviously haven't won with their new head coach yet, it's only been 2 games. I think there's time for them to figure it out and kind of get out of this little slide.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what the Habs were kind of riding when they were hot at the beginning of the year was just really hot streaks from a lot of young players, and maybe players that were overachieving at the beginning of the season. Like Josh Anderson had an amazing start to the season. He had like 9 goals in the first number of games there. But, like guys like that just kind of came back to earth a little bit. Like guys like, Kotkaniemi and Nick Suzuki were both off to hot starts as well. But when it comes to young, inexperienced guys like that, you can't rely on them to be your game-breaking players that's going to carry your team to the playoffs, because the Habs were the best team in the league at the very early parts of the season. And my take for them being second last in the division was looking pretty bad. But now they've kind of come back down to earth a little bit. And I think a huge reason too as to why that is Carey Price has been absolutely abysmal this season. He's got a 313 goals against average and 888 save percentage. Like those are numbers that would have been decent back in the 80s. But these are like, we're talking about the highest paid goalie and the best goalie that probably we've seen, the most dominant goalie anyway in this generation. And the Price is so critical to the way to the Habs' success. That when he's playing like the way he is right now, the Habs just essentially have no chance of being able to steal games that they shouldn't necessarily be winning. They had 8 wins in their first 12 games, but now they've lost 7 of their last 8. So the Habs have really fallen from grace where they were when they started at the top of the North Division.
Yeah, and I think as of now they're 2-5-3 in their last 10. So yeah, they really haven't been winning too much lately, and I don't think they're going to play at this pace for the rest of the season. I do think that there's, as much as it pains me to say it as a Leafs fan, I know the Habs have some talent, and I know they're a very hardworking team, and I do think they're going to end up making the playoffs by the end of the year. But you're right, Carey Price just hasn't been getting the job done for them this year, and it's kind of funny because I was looking at the Habs and Jets game yesterday before the game started, and I remember talking to this buddy of mine who's a Habs fan, and I said, do you think do you think the Habs are going to win tonight? And he said, yeah, Allen's starting, so I think they're going to get the win.
Yeah,
Not something I thought I would ever hear spoken in a sentence, but
yeah, Jake Allen's been their better goalie this year overall.
He has,
it's kind of surprising, but I'm sure, yeah, like you said, I'm sure they'll turn it around. Carey Price is still Carey Price. He goes through cold streaks as we've seen in the past, but he's got that that poise in net where it's very easy for him to just kind of turn it around once bounces start going his way and he gets his confidence back. I think I can speak for the entire hockey world when I say that it was very surprising at first to hear that Claude Julien was fired, because the Habs were like, yes, they had started to falter, but they were the hottest team in hockey at the beginning of the season. So to see a coach fired so soon after their team was just like the talk of the league is very surprising. But like, I think I agree with what you were saying. I think he was even already on the hot seat a little bit coming into the season.
Yeah.
And then, Bergevin was just kind of waiting and noticed, like, like this guy's kind of already, like you said, overstayed his welcome. And all it takes is one little losing streak like that, and you start to see the dressing room lose their coach, or the coach lose the dressing room a little bit, and then you realize it's time for a change. Dominique Ducharme, I like he was already a part of the Claude Julien staff. He was an assistant coach in Montreal. Yeah. But I like the replacement there for him as the head coach. This is his first head coaching gig in the league. And I kind of think that if they can turn things around a little bit, I think they should consider him as the favorite to fully replace Claude Julien as the long-term head coach. He was if you remember, he was the Team Canada's World Junior head coach back in 2017-18. In 2017, they won silver, and 2018 they won gold. So he's proven that he's got the accolades, and he's a coach that knows how to win. So I like that. I like that replacement there that the Habs have.
And I think what a lot of people got to remember too is that teams usually take a couple games when there's a transition period between coaches because you're adapting from one system to another. And I'm sure Ducharme's system is different than Julien's. So I wouldn't be throwing a white flag up after seeing the Habs lose their first two games under Ducharme. Not everyone's going to come out flying immediately under a new head coach. And like I said, it usually takes a couple games to provide a little bit of a buffer period. But in the end, I think the Habs have a much better outlook on the rest of the season with Ducharme. And like you said, his pedigree speaks for himself with coaching the World Junior teams. And I think the Habs will get out of this eventually, but it's definitely, it was a nice little wake up call for them because people were calling them a juggernaut after the first 10 games of the season. And it's like, okay, they're good, but they're not a juggernaut.
They're still, we have to consider they're still in a playoff spot right now. And part of that is because I think it's maybe a little bit deceptive, but I think the North Division is significantly, I don't know about weaker, but more fluid in terms of like the number of imperfect teams that are in this division, and teams that are like, they're all young, exciting teams, but they're not very like with that youth that we see from all the teams in the North Division. There's a lot of inexperience and ability to kind of like falter a little bit. So I think there's going to be a lot of fluidity amongst the standings in that league, in that division this year. Part of the reason why the Leafs have been so dominant, I think, as well, is because they've been able to be the most consistent team out of an entire division full of inconsistencies and imperfections. And I guess the next team that we can talk about here too is the Edmonton Oilers, who have now become they've kind of returned and started to play the way they originally were kind of expected to with Draisaitl and McDavid. The Edmonton Oilers have been extremely hot of late. They started off the season terrible. They lost they lost 6 of their first 9 games this season, and they were sitting outside of a playoff spot. So people were starting to question whether or not, they had enough depth to go along with Connor McDavid and Draisaitl up front, and whether or not this was going to be a team that could be sustainably good and actually contend for a playoff spot in the Stanley Cup. But now they've really started to turn it around, and I think a lot of it is because they've figured out their defensive prowess a little bit. Obviously McDavid and Draisaitl will be McDavid and Draisaitl regardless of whether they're winning or not. But you look at a guy like Darnell Nurse, who is now brought himself into the Norris Trophy conversation for best defenseman this year. And I think he has a very strong case for that. He is, especially with Oscar Klefbom out for the rest of the season in Edmonton, Darnell Nurse has stepped up and become their true number one defenseman. He's got 16 points. He plays in all situations, power play, penalty kill. He's their guy on the back end, and he just looks solid and offensively adept for leading and quarterbacking this team's back end. Darnell Nurse has always kind of been on the precipice of breaking out to become an elite defenseman, and I think this year he's really taken that next step.
Yeah, well, just like you said, I think that's exactly what the Edmonton Oilers are hoping for, and they drafted him 7th overall or whatever it was back in 2013 or 2012. He is an extremely talented defenseman. I think another big part of this too is Tyson Barrie's finally seemed to have found his game. And truth be told, especially after the news broke that Oscar Klefbom would be missing the whole season, I knew that Tyson Barrie was going to turn his game around in Edmonton, because realistically, the situation that he was in when he was in Toronto, Babcock misused the shit out of him at the start of the year. He tried to make him into a defensive player, which he's just simply never been. He's never been a two-way or a defense-minded defenseman. He's always been that puck-moving offensive defenseman. So right away, that fucked with his game. And then when the head coaching shift happened, he eventually started getting more opportunities, but he was still always battling with Morgan Riley for that number one offensive defenseman spot. And for a player like Tyson Barrie, for him to be good and thrive the way that we know he can, he has to be that number one offensive guy on a defensive core. That's why he was so successful in Colorado, and that's why he faltered in Toronto. I knew that he was going to find his game in Edmonton, because you put him in a situation where he can be that number one power play quarterback and feed the puck to McDavid and Draisaitl on the power play. Like, obviously the points are going to start to show for him. And
that's where he's going to thrive.
Season. He's got 18 points in 23 games so far, which is a huge step up from the 45 point pace I think he was on last year with Toronto.
Yeah, part of the reason why Tyson Barrie was so successful in Colorado too is because he was playing with Erik Johnson, who's one of the more underrated defensemen in the league, but he's a very solid defensive player. And Tyson Barrie was given the reins to sort of be that high-flying offensive guy that could just skate the ice, and he knew that Erik Johnson was always going to have his back and stay back and cover the defensive hole that would open up. And in Toronto, like you said, the Leafs just didn't use him in that way that allowed him to sort of thrive. They tried to turn him into something that he's not. But now again in Edmonton, they've kind of figured out what his role should be. And again, when you're a quarterback on the power play that features Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, you're going to be putting up points. Like, I could put up points if I was on a power play like
honestly,
that. So
you could line yourself up for a 10-goal, 50-assist season if you were playing with McDavid and Draisaitl.
Yeah.
Like, that's just the way it is.
Give them the puck, and then they just do whatever they want. And
exactly. You might be getting the fucking secondary assist every single time, but it all counts the same on the score sheet. It's all an assist.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think, if the Edmonton Oilers can really continue on this trajectory that they are, I think they will be that team that this will finally be that year where they can really cement themselves as genuine contenders, because I think it's long overdue that the Oilers kind of figure it out a little bit. And I think a huge part of the reason for that has been the fact that they've been getting a little bit more depth scoring from guys like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Kyler Yamamoto, and also, their defense is kind of starting to take shape a little bit more. They've got Evan Bouchard's finally getting like consistent minutes for the Oilers. So things are looking up for the Oilers, and I think their young guys are starting to kind of fill out the rest of their roster underneath McDavid and Draisaitl, which is going to give them the push that they need to really cement themselves as one of the top teams in the league, and particularly the North Division.
In my preseason predictions, I had the Oilers winning the North Division, for the record.
Yeah, I had them second.
Yeah, I thought they were. Actually, granted, I made that prediction before it was announced that Klefbom would miss the season, so that changes things a little bit for them. But I always thought that they just had the Leafs. Them and the Leafs, I think, had almost an identical amount of points last year. Like, I think Edmonton had 83, Toronto had 82, or something like that. And I figured Edmonton would probably finish first in the division this year. So while that might not be the case anymore, I think they can finish second easily. I think they've got the second most raw talent of any team in the North after Toronto. So
agreed, absolutely. And I think they're the biggest threat to the Leafs in that division to really like knock them out of the playoffs when the time comes around. At the beginning of the season, as we were talking about, the Habs looked like they were going to be that team that was sort of like the biggest threat to the high flying offense of the Leafs. And but you know, with them faltering a little bit, Edmonton's kind of like been able to take their place. Another team that I would just like to touch on a little bit too, that's been a very big surprise for me this year in a bad way, has been the Vancouver Canucks.
Oh boy,
they have been like, I mean, it's not like their players like you look at like their stat lines this year, and it's not like there's any particular play. Like Brock Besser is like top 10 in league scoring. Elias Peterson is playing the way he should, but you know, it just seems like their team is just a mess this year, and they don't have that same chemistry and kind of X factor that they had last year when they were that a bit of a Cinderella story in the bubble.
I think a big part of that too is I think the Canucks this year are kind of missing an identity. And I think they lost that identity in the offseason when they lost Chris Tanev and Jacob Markstrom.
Yeah.
I think those guys meant a lot more to the Canucks than people might have originally thought, because you see Markstrom leaving and you figure, oh, it's okay, they brought in Braden Holtby. And then you see Chris Tanev leaving, you're like, oh, they brought in Nate Schmidt, it's okay. But really, Nate Schmidt hasn't been as advertised this year for the Canucks, and neither is Braden Holtby. So I think those guys, Tanev and Markstrom, both really meant more to the Canucks than what a lot of people might have thought. And while I don't think they're going to be riding near the bottom of the standings, like hand in hand with Ottawa, like they have been recently, I still think they're going to miss the playoffs this year. They don't seem to have it.
Yeah, agreed. And I talking about Jacob Markstrom, like you could make the argument, and I would make the argument, that he was the Vancouver Canucks MVP last year. He was their best player, their most impactful player. He got some Vezina Trophy votes last year. Jacob Markstrom was an elite goaltender last year. And Braden Holtby has also been an elite goaltender at points during his career as well. But sometimes the fit just doesn't work, right? Like you know, Jacob Markstrom was like, in many ways, like kind of like the heart and soul of that run that they went on in the playoffs last year.
Yeah.
So when you lose a guy like that, you can't just necessarily replace him with another big name and expect it to fit well and run smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. There was something else I wanted to touch on. Oh yeah, I guess another part that you could mention about the Habs and a reason why they might have faltered a little bit after the start of the season. I think you got to remember there was a stretch of like 5 or 6 games in their hot streak where they played one of Ottawa or Vancouver.
Right.
So I'm not the kind of guy that'll be like, oh, well, your team isn't actually that good. Look at all the teams you've been playing. Because the reality is you're playing other NHL teams.
Mm-hmm.
Like people act like if you play the Senators, you play the Vancouver Canucks, it's basically the equivalent of playing a fucking 13-year-old house league team.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. I mean, I just did use them in an argument. And yeah, sure, it definitely helps the Habs when you get to play teams like that in a row. But it wouldn't be the sole reason that the Habs won those games. Like it wasn't a walk in the park for them, is what I'm trying to say.
And you still have to like be a good team in order to win against any team, right? Like and the Habs streak, like, you know, like Tyler Toffoli scored like 9 goals or something against the Vancouver Canucks.
8 of them against Vancouver.
8 of them against Vancouver. Yeah. And but you gotta consider, like, this is still like an NHL goaltender. Like, he's shooting on Braden Holtby. Like, he's like, this is an NHL goaltender and an NHL defensive core. And yeah, maybe they're not like as prominent as say like I don't know, like Colorado's D-core or something, another elite defensive team. But you're still like it's still not easy to be scoring that many goals on an NHL team. So like you can't really take that away from the Habs. It can be considered as part of the reason as to why they got off to such a hot start, but they still had to be feeling themselves and playing good hockey in order to pull off those wins.
Yeah.
All right. So should we move on to another one of the hottest teams in hockey?
I don't think they're another one of them. I think they're just simply the hottest team.
Hottest team in hockey.
Yeah.
The Los Angeles Kings. I mean,
I'll let you take the reins on this discussion.
At the time of this recording, the LA Kings have now lost their last 2 games. They lost to Minnesota twice. But if you watch those games, they were still playing good hockey, and they could have just as easily won the game. Last night they lost 4-3 in overtime, but they came back from a 3-0 lead. And before that, the LA Kings were on a 6-game winning streak. So part of the reason, and what you see from this from the LA Kings here is you might think, like this team is it's very different from the old LA Kings that were winning Stanley Cups back in the early 2010, 2012, and 2014. But it's funny because there's still 5 players that are remaining from those 2 Stanley Cup runs on the team, and all of them have been absolutely elite for the Kings of late during this the win streak, the recent win streak that they were on. Those players are Dowdy, Jeff Carter, Dustin Brown, Anze Kopitar, and Johnny Quick. And you just kind of started to see like a complete resurgence from all these players. Like Dustin Brown is playing some of the most elite hockey that he's played since like 2013. He has 11 goals and 6 assists for 17 points in 20 games so far this year. And a big part of the reason why Dustin Brown has been able to sort of find his game again, at least offensively, is because with young guys like Alex Iafallo and Blake Lizotte, and then trusty Anze Kopitar at the center spot, that's your penalty kill lineup now. So where Dustin Brown used to be one of the Kings' primary penalty killers, he's not been getting those minutes this year on special teams. And what it's resulted in is Dustin Brown has then been able to sort of focus his game on his usual power forward type style of game, where he just crashes the net and scores goals like he used to back in his prime. So he's sort of been able to refine this part of his game because he's not focused on the defensive aspect as much. And what you see is Dustin Brown has been the Kings' best goal scorer this year so far. Anze Kopitar, you could put him in the conversation for the Hart Trophy so far this year if it weren't for the elite play of McDavid and Draisaitl. He's got 23 points in 20 games and 19 assists. So he's been close to leading the league in assists for this entire season. And Anze Kopitar shows no signs of slowing down in his game. Anze Kopitar's style of play is one that will age very well and has aged well so far. Just the fact that he plays a bit of a slower style of game. He's not a high flying like speedster out there, but he's a great playmaker. Big body, and it's really he's almost been unstoppable for the Kings so far this year. Definitely their MVP so far. Drew Dowdy is having one of his best offensive seasons with 17 points in 20 games. He's almost a point a game player, and he's been sturdy on the back end as usual. And Johnny Quick, despite the fact that in recent seasons Johnny Quick has started to appear like he's really been in the decline of his career. Especially when it comes to injuries and the inability to stay healthy. Part of the reason for that is just his traditional style of game is really hard on the body. Like the fact that he's always in the splits and his very acrobatic style of goaltending was not sustainable for an aging player. But recently he has 2 shutouts in his last 4 games, and he's been backstopping the Kings to victory after victory. And then there's Jeff Carter, who I mentioned as well, who has 12 points. He's just kind of been a solid, steady player, despite the fact that he's 36 years old. He hasn't shown signs of slowing down in terms of foot speed yet. So the Kings have just kind of been riding a hot streak from all of their veteran players. And their younger players have kind of filled in nicely underneath them, and they're learning from them. And hopefully we can see that transition of power persist throughout the rest of the season. And the Kings currently are contending for a playoff spot. I believe right now they're 5th now after their loss last night in the West Division.
They are still 4th, actually.
They're still 4th? Okay.
Yes. They are 1 point ahead of Arizona. Spot.
I thought the Kings were going to be abysmal this year and finish easily at the bottom of this division. But much like the Chicago Blackhawks as well, who have kind of been on the same trajectory for the past decade as the Kings, they're getting a little bit of a resurgence from their older players, and their younger players are learning from them and filling in nicely underneath. So it's exciting to see, and hopefully they can keep it up for the rest of the year.
Yeah. If you watched the episode of Pump Take 2 weeks ago, between us, you'll remember that I proposed that the Leafs trade for Alex Iafallo. I would like to officially rescind that take, because at the time I believed it would be a possibility because the Kings weren't in a playoff spot at the time. And I thought that the Kings would be in a position where they'd be looking to sell come the deadline. But if the Kings keep playing like this, I think they'd be buying instead of selling. I don't think they'd be willing to trade a guy like Iafallo. So
no,
I think it's surprising to see their play this year. They've done much better than expected, for sure. And I think they've gotten some secondary production from guys like Andreas and how do you say that? Athanasiou, yes. I was about to say it, and I knew I was going to butcher it, so I figured I'd just stop while I was ahead and let you do it. He's played well in a small sample size. He's got 7 points in 12 games. Jared Anderson-Dolan's got 5 points in 6 games. They've been able to get this kind of secondary scoring from their young guys, and you're kind of seeing a healthy mix of veterans. Like you said, you brought up all the guys that are almost seeing a collective resurgence in their careers, and then you've also got offense being chipped in from younger guys like the ones I just mentioned. So I think
I like to throw in Adrian Kempe into that mix as well. He's also been having a great season as a depth player. But yeah, like if you, it's great to see that mix of like the old vets that were winning cups with the Kings kind of like leading the way for the younger players in the new generation. Because this is a bit of the Kings are in a transitionary period right now. But yet despite that fact, they've been able to sort of defy expectations and kind of remain a little bit competitive, at least so far this year, which is the best possible situation that you can ask for, because all these young players are now getting better experience. They're not just on a losing team, but they're actually contending for a playoff spot, and they know what it's like to win games. And they're learning from all these players that have won cups before, and hopefully they can kind of pick up on that winning mentality and sort of translate it to their own games going forward.
And I think that if the Kings are in a spot where they're legitimate playoff contenders as we get closer to the trade deadline, I personally think they should just say fuck it and go for it. Because honestly, like you could argue the Kings have the best prospect pool in the entire NHL at this point. And while it's always great to add more and more picks, it's not like they're in a position where prospects and picks are a dire need for them. So whether or not they're at the point where they're ready to sell those prospects and picks to buy, I don't know. Maybe don't buy at the deadline, but I just keep their lineup intact and just see what they can do this year. And then obviously as you get closer to next year, and you know, who knows what the Kings will be capable of when they bring up the best hockey player on the face of the earth, Quentin Byfield, and some more of their young talent, Arthur Kaliyev, Rasmus Kupari. Like they've got guys who can fill in the roles of those veteran players you mentioned that are having a resurgence. So I think the Kings are on their way up quicker than some people might believe. Yeah, and I don't like when you were mentioning whether they should buy or sell. I agree that I think they should just kind of stand pat. If they wanted to add like another depth winger maybe, or a middle pairing defenseman, that would be helpful if they wanted to go for a little bit of a playoff run this year and see how it can go. But mortgaging their future and their prospect pool to try and win right now would be idiotic, and it wouldn't make any sense. Like the reality is that the Kings are looking to build around guys like Byfield and Turcotte and Kaliyev and Kupari. That's your future. The Kings will likely not win another Stanley Cup with the core as it is with Kopitar, Brown, Dowdy, Carter, and Quick. That's just very unlikely to happen, considering the fact that those players are much older, and despite the fact that they are off to a hot start this year, they're just not the players that they were when they were winning cups. So the reality of that is that if you're not really genuinely contending for a Stanley Cup, then mortgaging your future to try to improve those minuscule odds at taking it home, it just doesn't make any sense. No, so you might as well just wait. See how far you can go this year. We don't need another high pick in the draft. So if they want to make the playoffs and go on a little run, fine by me. But maintain the current prospect pool that you have, because it is the best in the league. And the Kings look like they have one of the brightest futures in the league, and they'll be right back in the playoffs legitimately on an annual basis in no time. So I agree.
All right. Well, if that's everything that we have to talk about today, I guess we can wrap it up here.
Guess so.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on Pump Take Sports.
Take it easy.